Welcome back to the Oxendine Law Podcast. I'm your host, Jarrod Oxendine. I have my co-host here, Christine Palmer, and we're going to talk about prenuptial agreements today and postnuptial agreements, which some people don't even know exist. So, look, prenuptial agreements are very much misunderstood.
They are.
And while they may not sound like a romantic topic, they're actually a very important way to protect your future assets, your future earnings, and set very clear expectations from a financial standpoint of what to expect going into your marriage. So let's talk about what a prenuptial agreement is, why you might need one, and how it can actually possibly even strengthen your relationship.
Sure.
So Christine, what's a prenup?
So a prenuptial agreement, I want to clear the air early on because I get a lot of questions about this. A prenuptial agreement is a contract which the two people enter into prior to being married that dictates, and this is the important part, friends, what happens in the event of a divorce. It does not in any way dictate what occurs during your marriage. So some people come in and they're like, well, can I get in a prenuptial agreement that while we're married, she'll contribute minimum $300 a month to our savings account? No, you cannot. This contract is like a ghost contract. You don't even know that it exists until the day someone files for divorce. So prenuptial agreement is going to be a contract regarding terms that will go into effect only if one of you files a divorce.
I had a crazy guy call me one time, and this is on what you just said.
Uh-huh.
And he wanted a prenuptial agreement that literally said his wife and him had to have sex.
Yeah.
A certain number of times.
I've had it. Yeah.
Per week.
Uh-huh. Sometimes they are not, they're culturally different.
Uh-huh.
Yes, people that want those sorts of things in. I've had ones that she will not work. Request, can we put it in the prenuptial agreement that she won't work? That if she gets pregnant, at 4 months pregnancy, she'll stop her job and stay home until that kid or the youngest kid is 18 years old. So
and what do we tell these folks? You can't do it.
No.
And here's the thing,
don't.
from a practical standpoint, right? Life happens.
Yeah.
I mean, imagine if you could lock yourself into some of these crazy scenarios. Let's say you enter into a prenuptial agreement that says, my wife and I have to have sex 5 times a week.
Right.
There might be some weeks where you have sex 10 times, right? But let's say the week comes for whatever reason, you're not feeling good or the vibe's not there or whatever, and you breach the agreement because you don't want to have sex with your wife 5 times that week. Then what happens?
And now he can't perform.
So I thought that was an important point. Prenuptial agreements dictate what happens in the event of a divorce. It's not how you run your marriage.
Correct.
So we're talking about once Susie and Tom get divorced, here are the assets Tom's going to get, here are the assets Susie's going to get, and is there going to be alimony? And if so, how much? You can also address attorney's fees. Well, we'll get to this in a second. Let's talk about certain things that prenuptial agreements can't contain. We'll do that in a second. Okay. But one of the very most important things in getting a prenup is you have to make sure it's done correctly.
Right.
You can't just go online and pull out a form. You can't draft a contract yourself and have your spouse sign it. It has to contain certain terms. It has to be done a certain way. It has to be witnessed a certain way. It has to be notarized a certain way. And probably the most important thing, and I say most important because you'd be surprised how many people forget to do this step. But any of the things I just mentioned, if they're not done, your prenuptial agreement can fail.
Yeah.
If it's done right, it actually will be enforced. There is a very high rate of prenuptial agreements being upheld if they're done the correct way. But the thing that people screw up so often, either intentionally or unintentionally, is the failure to include the financial disclosures. Prenuptial agreements have to be entered into by both parties, with both parties knowing full disclosure of all the financial circumstances. So what do I mean by that? Literally, there has to be a financial disclosure from husband. There has to be a financial disclosure from wife that lists out every single bank account, every single retirement account, every single investment account, cars, what they're worth, debt, if you have some, how much is owed, where you work, how much money you make.
Current salary, yes.
I mean, full financial disclosure. If you don't do that, your prenuptial agreement will be set aside. If you intentionally fail to disclose something, your prenuptial agreement will be set aside. And I can't tell you how many times even attorneys do not include the financial disclosure.
Right. Well, and that's where you're having the conversation with your client is so important, because if you just tell a client, hey, all right, here's the deal. I need to know all of what you have and I need to know all of what she has. Give it to me and I'll draft the prenup. Okay. They might just include the important stuff naturally. And they give it to us, and we haven't cross-examined them and asked them, are you sure this is everything? You got to explain why it's important. So, I mean, how many times have you seen that they left off, oh, they still have that one bank account that their parents are on that they opened when they were in college. And yeah, it's still open. And yeah, I mean, it has like $7-8 grand in it, but it doesn't matter because it's an asset that is theirs that has to be disclosed. It's literally everything. If you had a 401k from your last job and you're not even at that job anymore and it just sits dormant, nobody's contributing to it, but it's out there, that has to be disclosed. So any and all assets in your name. So that's why the communication is so important. You have to educate the client of why we do what we do so that they can help us give the information. Because if a client comes to me and says, this is everything, I have no way of checking that, vetting that. I can't subpoena every institution in the United States to ask if they have something else. Property, same thing. Did you inherit a random house up in the mountains from your grandparents that technically is in your name and an Airbnb runs it? Anything that is in your name has to be disclosed. And that's why the clients have to be fully honest with us, but we also have to educate them of why they need to be fully honest with us.
So once you have made sure it's drafted correctly, you can actually get very creative prenups.
Yeah.
I'll give a few examples. We don't have time to cover everything a prenuptial agreement could contain because everybody does them a little differently. But for example, without a prenuptial agreement, any assets acquired during the marriage, doesn't matter whether a husband acquires it, doesn't matter whether a wife acquires it, it's going to be marital. Yeah. And it's going to be subject to being divided during the divorce. Some people are okay with that. They will have their prenuptial agreement say, if it was earned during the marriage, then we're going to equally divide it.
That's fair.
You don't have to do it that way.
Right.
It can say anything that is earned by husband, as long as it's an account only in his name, we get divorced, husband gets to keep it. Same thing with wife. Any assets that wife acquires during the marriage, through her employment or otherwise, as long as it's maintained in her separate name, she gets to keep it. And the only thing we're going to equally divide is anything we decide to put in joint names. If we buy a house together,
right,
or if we open up like a joint savings account or a joint investment account, then we'll equally divide that. I mean, there's a million different ways, these things can be handled.
And we most commonly see that situation in second marriages. So you'll oftentimes have people who are a little bit later in life, have come together, but everything that they had from the beginning, they have children. They want to make sure that that stays intact, that original earnings, the original property, whatever it is, the investments, that retirement that was indicated back when you earned it all to be passed on to your children, that gets to stay. But that shouldn't negate this new chapter that you're beginning. You've got a new spouse and y'all are going to do things together as well. So being able to sort of keep those two areas of your life in a very peaceful way. So there is no question of who gets what and when in the event of this divorce. It's not where the kids think your new wife is coming after what is their inheritance, or, vice versa, where the new wife who you love, if you get divorced, you get, like, the kids are like, well, this is all of ours, so you're just able to sort of keep these two things separated, and not have those worlds collide. So commonly we see those in second marriages.
Well, and that kind of brings up the second point is who should consider prenup. So obviously the big thing that screams at me is if you have already acquired significant assets. So you're about to get married and you've acquired significant property interest, business interest, investment accounts, saving accounts, retirement accounts, whatever it is. You want to protect that, and rightfully so. So people that have significant assets really should consider getting a prenuptial agreement because we can control what happens to those assets. We can protect them. We can safeguard them through a prenuptial agreement. For example, some people may decide to take something they own. So let's say they got a bank account that's got $100,000 in it, and they take that money out of that bank account and they go and they purchase something else with that money during the marriage. And maybe they add some marital money to it. Well, we can have the prenuptial agreement say that it doesn't matter if it changes forms. Just because I took my $100,000 from my savings account and then I invested it in something else during the marriage, right? You still get to keep that money.
Right.
Without a prenuptial agreement, you don't get to keep that.
That's right. You've converted that, commingled those funds from separate premarital to a marital asset.
That's right. The other big reason, business owners have huge exposure if they don't get prenuptial agreements.
Yeah.
I mean, some people get married and they have very successful businesses, and those businesses are growing in value. Mm-hmm. Every year, they're gaining employees, they're growing in value, they're creating more revenue. Maybe they're even acquiring additional assets, equipment, inventory. All that goes into the value of a business. So let's say you get married and you're a business owner and you don't have a prenuptial agreement and you stay married for 20 years and your business goes from being worth $200,000 when you got married to being worth $10 million.
And make the scenario worse. You're a 1/3 owner. So while your asset value in the business is substantial, this isn't something you can liquidate or sell in the event of a divorce to buy her out. So you've got business partners now that hate you. You've got a wife that hates you.
Yeah.
So you've come into a very complicated scenario.
Point. You can't sell your business to buy your spouse out.
You can't.
You now have to either pay them out monthly over a long period of time to give them their share of equity in the business, or you're giving them, a large share of your remaining liquid assets.
You have to figure out where else to buy them out from.
Just so you can keep your interest in the business. Without a prenuptial agreement, your spouse is entitled to a share of those gains that were made during the marriage as far as the value of the business is concerned. With a prenuptial agreement, we can very simply say, I owned this business before I got married, and any increase in value whatsoever that happens to my business during the marriage, my spouse has no interest. Or we can limit the interest.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be zero.
Sure.
It can be limited to 10%, or it could be a flat dollar amount or whatever.
Yeah.
The point is we can get very creative with these prenuptial agreements, and we can tailor an agreement that is fair.
Right.
And that works for both parties. It doesn't have to be one-sided. It can be fair to both sides.
Mm-hmm.
But without one coming in with business, coming in with significant assets, you're really opening yourself up for some major exposure.
Sure. And I've also seen them as what I would call sort of just an extra layer of protection in people who tend or expect to inherit money or property. In Georgia, if you've inherited something during the marriage and you're able to keep it separate, that is your separate property. But if it is in any way commingled, it becomes marital property. So you can give that advice ahead of time and tell them don't commingle, but arguments can always be made as to what commingling is. That's what attorneys do, is I argue one side, they argue the other side. So with a prenuptial agreement, I can put it in black and white where there is no question that if anything comes through an inheritance to you, that it remains your separate property, extra layer of protection. So like, you're not just relying on Georgia law that's on the books. You're saying these two people contemplated this, contracted for this, and she waived any interest into what I'm going to be inheriting in the future.
Well, which kind of brings me to like myth number one, right? A lot of people, I think this is a myth, would say, well, a prenuptial agreement is going to make my divorce more complicated.
Not at all.
It's actually the opposite.
Right.
It's going to make it easier. It's already done, basically, right? I mean, we already know if you get divorced, here's how we divide everything.
Yeah.
So it's just transactional at that point. There's nothing to argue over, with an exception. It's going to be part of the myth. Kids, we're going to talk about kids, right? But it's a myth to say that having a prenuptial agreement is going to make my divorce more complicated. It's actually going to do the opposite. It's going to make it more simple.
Sure. On the financial side, Jarrod and I have two things we have to accomplish in a divorce. Number one is determining what are the assets. And then number two is how are they divided. Those two things are taken care of because we've got our financial disclosure. We know what the assets are, like as in who owns what exists. That sure, there may be new assets that have been accumulated. Those are easier to find. And then how are they divided? Same story. We've already got that mapped out for us. Right. So it's just performing the functions as opposed to trying to get on the same page of what they are. Now, if you can do it while y'all are a happy couple together and have this conversation and get it on paper, trust me, that outcome's going to be better than if you're doing it when you hate each other in the middle of a context of a divorce.
Exactly right. Spell another myth, because I mentioned kids. I let the cat out of the bag too early. Some people assume that you can address everything related to your divorce in a prenuptial agreement, and you can't.
You cannot.
The thing we cannot address in your prenuptial agreement is anything relating to your kids. So if you have kids during the marriage, your prenuptial agreement cannot dictate what custody is going to be in advance, what parenting time is going to be in advance, or even what child support will be in advance. Right. We can only control division of assets, division of debt, attorney's fees, and alimony.
Right.
All right. Myth number 3. And I think this is a myth. At least I see this in my practice. It's a myth to say that my fiance is going to be upset with me if I ask for a prenuptial agreement. Some are. The vast majority, in my opinion, what I see, are not. They actually understand. They get it, right? So in other words, you're the person, maybe it's your second marriage, or maybe you got married late in life and you've accumulated assets or a business. There's nothing wrong with telling your fiance, hey, if we get divorced, it's fair for me to be able to keep the stuff that I brought into the marriage.
Sure.
Most of the time, fiancés understand that, and it doesn't cause an argument. Are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a huge red flag if it's just met with like the absolute blow up, how dare you throw things, be dramatic, because
then
that
you
is
need to
gonna
run.
now if it's the first time you're bringing it up, it might be a little awkward. It might be a question of why do you think that's important? But if you have that answer prepared, is simply I feel like everything that you have, everything I have, we earned before us, just needs to stay that way. And we're about to embark on a marriage together. So everything that we build together will be ours to split should that divorce day ever come.
Yeah, and I said it earlier, I'll say it again. Prenuptial agreements can be fair, right?
Yeah.
I mean, don't think that just because it's a prenuptial agreement, it's one-sided. Some are. I've done plenty that are, and people have signed it, and that's fine if that's what they want to do. But, a prenuptial agreement that allows both people to protect what they brought into the marriage, but then equitably and in a fair way and reasonably divides what's acquired during the marriage is fair.
It is, yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. So I highly would encourage any folks that are in a circumstance where you're thinking about getting married, you got some assets, you own a business, you've got exposure there, you need to consider very strongly a prenuptial agreement. It will save you a lot of time, save you a lot of money, save you a lot of argument if you unfortunately get divorced one day. Now, before we wrap this episode up, we talked about prenuptial agreements. Let's talk quickly, Christina, about postnuptial agreements. A lot of people don't know that even exists.
Yeah, I think that's a way less common phenomenon than that prenup.
What's a postnuptial agreement?
So a postnuptial agreement is going to sort of accomplish the same thing, but it comes after the parties have been married. So sometimes it comes because you've entered a bit of a rough patch and you think, all right, well, if we just knew what was going to happen over here, we can get that out of the way and focus on the counseling and sort of the therapeutic part of our marriage without it hanging over our heads what might happen in the event of a divorce. That's one scenario. Another scenario is you just didn't do the prenup and you're just now getting educated. You think, dang, I really should have done that. Like what they're saying makes sense. That's me. That pertains to me. So it's not too late to talk about doing a postnuptial agreement. I think postnuptial agreements, I don't want to say are always going to be more fair. I don't want to say fair, but they're, you can do a prenuptial agreement that is a little bit unfair. That's like, hey, I have all the money and I want to make sure you're not marrying me for my money. So you got to sign off saying that everything that used to be mine is mine. So in a postnuptial, it's most likely going to be very fair, very even. It's not likely that one party's going to say, everything we've accumulated is now mine. And if you want to stay married to me, you sign on the line, right?
If not, if it's not fair, what's the motivation for the other person
Correct.
to enter into
They're
it?
not
You're
gonna
already married.
sign it. Yeah.
Right? There's no benefit to signing it if it's
so
not fair.
sometimes that's an easier subject to approach is just, hey, I've learned about this idea and, I never thought my brother would be divorced and look at him over there. Just like we have insurance on our cars, we have insurance on our house, we have insurance on our lives. Why not put some insurance on your marriage?
And quick funny story. Okay, I got to tell this story. You know what's coming.
I do.
Our favorite
Postnuptial
postnuptial agreement story in the office. True story. Not going to use names, but we had a client. She was married, did not have a prenuptial agreement, but she literally was the one earning all the money in that marriage. Now they both worked, but she made more money than him. She was a saver. He was a spender. Like most of the assets were in her name. And so in the event of a divorce, she was looking at having to give him a portion of her assets. Again, they're acquired during the marriage, but they're in her name. In her mind, this is my stuff.
Yeah,
right?
she worked
and she
for it
wanted
all.
to keep it. Now, here's what her way out was. And she was smart lady. And we came up with this beautiful game plan and pulled it off flawlessly. So let me give you the quick story, guys. He was a serial adulterer. He was out cheating all the time. She had caught him once. She forgave him. She took him back. She caught him twice, forgave him, took him back. I think she actually took him back for a third time. And then finally, after the fourth time, she was done. Yeah. But instead of going out and filing for divorce, she came and she consulted with us. And we came up with a beautiful game plan. Because the guy was begging at her feet, wanting to stay married. But she had all this financial exposure, potentially. Yeah. She could have argued that adultery is the reason for the divorce, but then she still is not guaranteed.
Yeah, that's a bar to
walk
alimony.
away with all of her assets.
Right.
She's still probably going to have to give up some of her assets. Maybe she gets a larger percentage, but she's still looking at giving him some money.
Maybe. Some judges are still going to say, hey, the benefit of not paying alimony is a benefit.
That's right.
50-50 on the rest.
That's right. So We sat down with her and we said, you know what? We have an idea. Since your husband wants to stay married to you so bad and he's promised you he's never going to do this again, how about we do a postnuptial agreement?
Yeah.
That says, and it was more detailed than this, I'm making it simple for the podcast. If you ever cheat on me again, if you ever commit adultery again during the marriage, then I get to keep all the assets. And we drew up a postnuptial agreement that said just that.
Right.
If husband commits adultery again, wife can file for divorce and she gets 100% of the assets. He signed it.
Right.
He signed it.
Desperate times call for desperate measures.
Within 6 months, she was back in our office. She filed for divorce. She got 100% of the assets. True story.
Yep.
Good for her. What a great game plan.
Right.
It worked out beautiful. So happy for her. Hopefully he learned his lesson. I don't know if he got married again to some other poor woman. I doubt he'll ever sign a postnuptial agreement again.
True.
All right, folks. We hope you benefited from that podcast. A lot of good, helpful information in there about not only prenuptial agreements, but also postnuptial agreements. If you're considering getting married and you've got a business or you have significant assets at stake, get a consult with a professional. They can help you protect those assets in the event that you end up getting divorced. Thanks for hanging with us today. Check us out on all the major social media platforms. If you're watching us on YouTube, make sure you subscribe so that you get automatic notification of all of our podcast episodes. Thanks for joining in. We'll see you next time.